What's going on, guys? It's Robert Rowland. Today is Tuesday, the 5th. Well, actually, it's Wednesday the 5th. I'm sorry. I'm a day behind. I know it's been a while since I've done my last podcast. So, obviously, from the last podcast that I recorded, there's been some changes in my life that have taken place, and I did do a little bit of traveling last week and checked out the new location, and it was exactly as expected, which is very interesting. But don't really want to get into that in this podcast. What I really want to talk about in this podcast is narcissist and how to communicate as a narcissist and how to communicate with a narcissist. I think that's one of the toughest things as a narcissist, or when you're dealing with a narcissist. Me being an ex-narcissist and going through the recovery process, and taking all the steps, I found that communication is one thing that's been super vital and one of the most difficult things, and very important thing, not just with narcissists, but just in relationships in general. Not just intimate relationships, just in a relationship in general. Communication is super important, and I know books and people all say, communication and trust are key and all that other stuff. They're absolutely right. But for me, what I found that communication as a narcissist, and especially when you're communicating with a person that you've hurt, just trying to have that ground of communication and just talking to them about general topics. I've learned that those conversations always tend to not end well. And as a narcissist, there's really nothing you can do at that point, except walk away and accept it for what it is. As a narcissist, and people call you a sociopath and things like that, within that whole recovery process and all the things that you've been through. I've been saying this podcast after podcast after podcast, you have to, move on from that, from those things. People aren't gonna understand that you're taking the steps of recovery and that you're changing because they're so used to the way you were, and you can try to prove yourself to them, but honestly, the recovery and the changing, shouldn't be about them, and you shouldn't go out of your way to prove yourself to an individual anyways. It's going to come to them on their own time, and all you're going to do is wind up hurting yourself, if you're trying to prove yourself to an individual or individuals in general. You're just going to become more frustrated because they're not seeing it. They're not understanding. They're continuing to call you a liar. They're continuing to say you're never going to change and things like that. So, from what I've learned is, it's best for you just to kind of stay silent, and, continue down your path of recovery, and continue to do the right thing, and communicate as best as you can. And when you're communicating to these people, and if they are pushing back on you, saying you're never going to change, you're lying, I'm not saying you just say whatever and walk away. You try to offer them a little bit of proof, and show them that you are changing. If they're still rebelling or pushing back from it, just kind of say, okay, and just give it space and time. Some people will never forgive you and never understand that you've changed because of the amount of hurt that you've done, over over the course of the relationships or friendships or whatever it is. You know, that's a very fine line, because you still have to assume and accept responsibility for the damage that you've done, whatever it is. You know, and some people still harbor, you know, that burden of pain, and associate that pain and anger towards you. So the communication aspect, if you're trying to communicate with that person, may not be there, you know, and it may never be there, because, you know, they still are hurt by you. So regardless if you love that person and things like that, you know, sometimes that communication option may not be there. But for the other people that are that are listening, that aren't narcissists, that are in relationships with narcissists, or are helping people along with narcissists. And like I said, I'm not a therapist, you know, by any means. This is just my personal opinion. Some people may disagree with me 100%. If you do, that's fine. You know, I'm not a therapist. I haven't been to school for this, anything like this. I'm just talking from my personal experience, you know, and what I would have liked to have happened, and to may have possibly helped me along and made things a little bit better and easier for me is, you know, if you're dealing with a narcissist and you're in a relationship and you're committed to them, is to be cautious of how you communicate with the narcissist. I'm not saying put on white gloves and be super delicate, because sometimes, you know, tough love is absolutely needed. Like for my example, the tough love was 100% absolutely needed for me to accept and to change, you know, the path that I was on. You know, I needed to completely crash and fall on my face, you know, for me to lose what I cherished and what I loved, for me to wake up, you know, assume responsibility, take responsibility, go to therapy, you know, and make these life changes, you know, for me to say, hey, wake up, Rob, there's something wrong with you. You know, look at your life. Look at the things that you've done over the course of your life. You know, look at all these relationships you've been involved in. Look at how many friendships you have and had. You know, what's the variable in it? What's the constant, and what's happening in them? And it's you. The things that you're doing, you know, are wrong. So when you're dealing with someone that has narcissism and are narcissistic, and you're standing by them, you know, it's and they're willing to go, and they're going through the process of recovery. You know, it's not really good or helpful to really remind them of everything that they've done wrong. You know, yeah, you're going to touch bases on the things that I've done wrong, but when something doesn't happen your way, you know, when you're dealing with a narcissist when you're dealing with the person in recovery, you know, when you're reminiscing about things and things are happening, you know, the past has to stay in the past, you know, and when this person is going through the recovery, you can't conveniently bring in something that happened in the past, you know, and an attribute of the personality, you know, and make it conveniently, readily available now to apply to what's happening currently. You know, if you're willing to take that fresh start, and this person is genuinely taking these stages and steps, and you are seeing these changes and steps within this person, you know, when they are doing something, or they did something, you know, that upset you, that ticked you off, that, you know, upset you, like I said, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that they're turning back into their old ways. You know, it doesn't mean that, oh God, they're a narcissist again and they didn't get any help. You know, depending on how severe things are, you know, relationships aren't all hunky-dory. And honestly, if they are all hunky-dory, chances are 9 times out of 10, you really don't probably love the person, because, you know, I can tell you from my experience, when I was married, you know, to my ex-wife, she did absolutely nothing that upset me. You know, she never irritated me, nothing like that. It just didn't bother me. Nothing she did upset me. Everything was cool as far as my attitude towards her. And then I realized that I never loved her. I really didn't care. You know, and then When I met the person that I actually genuinely cared for and fell in love with, things that she did, did upset me, and it's because you love that person enough and you love that person so much that little things and things do bother you because you love that person. And two people that love each other, they are absolutely going to have arguments. They are going to disagree. They are going to have little, little fights, and arguments. That's perfectly normal. But at the same time, you have to be 100% fair when it comes to, the communication aspect of dealing with, the arguments. And when you're dealing with a narcissist, being male or female, if you're continuing on in a relationship, you just can't bring back in, like, hey, you're a narcissist, you're a liar, this is what it is. So screw you. I'm gonna do me. I'm gonna do what I want. That's not really fair to, the ex-narcissist or the person that's dealing with the recovery. That's basically holding them back, and that's not, helping the situation, and it's not getting anyone anywhere further. So, like I said, communication is super important, and being able, the two people, being able to sit down and just talk about what's going on, and harboring no ill feelings, and being able to communicate peacefully and amicably is super important. And I'll give you guys a really quick story of something that happened just a couple days ago. One of my exes, someone that I was completely involved with, she claimed to 100% love me. She was supposedly madly in love with me, and we were together for a number of years. And the relationship went completely south, and for me, it was kind of like whatever. I didn't really have strong feelings for this person. My family didn't like her at all. When we ended things, it was kind of like, it's over. Our relationship was hot and cold the whole time anyways. We were never really, there was never really a level playing ever or a balance ever in this relationship. Well, we had conversation just a few days ago, and, finally, she asked me why did things turn out the way they did when she supposedly loved me so much. And I just straight up told her, I was like, look, the situation is that, one, at that time when we were together, I wasn't loving myself. So there was absolutely no way, I could have loved anyone else, because I didn't even know myself. I was still lying to myself. I was still having, issues within myself. So it wasn't right for me to share my heart with someone when I didn't even know what my heart was, and number two, I never loved you, and for her, that was like, the world ending. And I told her, I was like, I'm really sorry, that I'm saying it so bluntly, but that is the 100% God honest truth, and I was like, and I'm gonna explain to you exactly why. And I'm not saying this to hurt you. It's basically, like I said, at the point in time that we were together, I wasn't sure of who I was, and I'm sorry for all of the hurt and pain that I've caused you. However, you knew all of these things that were happening within me, with all these medical conditions that I had within myself, and you continued on and pursued and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed for this relationship with me, and you knew the whole time my family wanted absolutely nothing to do with you. And, I was rebelling and pulling away, and finally when we were separated, she was pushing, and that was basically the end of it. So we didn't talk for a number of years at all. And then finally, a couple days ago, we talked, and I'll continue on into the story on the next podcast. Thanks.